And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello, and thanks for tuning into the Teach Thought podcast. If you're a return listener, thanks so much for your listenership. And if you are a new listener, thanks for tuning in. I hope you find it helpful. A few housekeeping notes. I wanted to mention that we have a new PBL Online Foundations course that is a mix of synchronous and asynchronous learning that will be capped at 35 and a minimum of 10 participants. It's $199 and will take place over 3 weeks in June with some, again, synchronous and asynchronous learning and work sessions. You can find that in the blog section under PBL. Also worth noting, registration will be closing soon for our PBL Grow 23 event in Louisville. That is in Louisville and will be taking place June 26th through 28th. You can find information on that, of course, on our website at wegrowteachers.com/grow23. And of course, if you're a school leader or administrator looking for help with your teachers and your staff, you can find all of our professional development services and workshops on our webpage, which again is wegrowteachers.com. And you can always reach out to me with any questions or ideas or concerns regarding this podcast or professional development or any other parts of our work. My email address is drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with John Hattie, who many of you will know from his work over the years in research and his 2009 book, Visible Learning. He has a new book called Visible Learning, the Sequel, and we started our conversation at the end of the book talking about some of the conclusions and things he's learned since the writing of the first book. We unpacked the idea of knowing that, knowing how, and knowing with, or also known as surface, deep, and transfer learning. We talked about evaluative thinking, and then a bit about his research methods and some of the criticisms that he's received and his responses to that. And then we kind of walked through the book through those frames, as well as the frame of his view of the purpose of schooling. And a big piece that came through was the complexity of teaching, and that we need to think about the complexity of what students are learning and their cognitive load. So we talked about the student, the home and family, school and society, classroom effects, the teacher, the curriculum, teaching with intent, learning strategies, and teaching strategies, which are definitely related to teaching with intent. And then using tech and whole school, and some of his big takeaways as we finished, of course, at the end of the book, and some of his conclusions moving forward. We talked about problem-based learning or project-based learning and inquiry and direct and explicit instruction and all kinds of things. And this is a great resource. And as always, I enjoy talking with John. He's a wealth of knowledge and certainly has lots of expertise. And as always, I hope you find it helpful. John, welcome back to the podcast. Nice to have you back. I imagine you probably want to say hi before we start diving into all this visible learning, the sequel stuff. But now's your chance to say hello.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to talk to you again and talk with your listeners. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And the last time we talked, I didn't look it up. Your son was on with us, and you had a really great book about parenting, and we talked about that. I'll have to look that up and make sure we link it in the show notes. But you got a new one, and it's not been out very long, right? It's Visible Learning, the Sequel, and a synthesis of over 2,100 meta-analysis relating to achievement. And it's quite lengthy, and I enjoyed it, even though it doesn't have a novel feel to it. It's a lot of research, right? It's a lot of interesting things to sort of unpack. As I was talking before we started recording, I wanted to sort of start at the end and then come back to the beginning and sort of work through some of these pieces. Obviously, I think it was 2009, the first one came out, right? Is that right? And you have written a bunch of books since then and done lots of work since then. And as you write in the book, you talk about some of the criticisms, but you also have some conclusions of what you have learned 14 years later. And I think that might be a good a way to frame this conversation, and you talk in the conclusion about sort of 9 moves, and then sort of a poverty of implementation. And maybe if you have some things to say about, like, what are the big takeaways from 2009 to now, and how would you encapsulate that for folks as a framing method?
Well, Drew, I wrote the book in 2009. I thought to get it out of my system and sort of culminate it before I retired, and it kind of didn't work that way. It kind of opened up a whole new dimension. And one of the things, the world didn't stop in 2009. People still continued to publish meta-analyses. I spent quite a lot of my time working with teams of people, implementing it in schools, probably 10, 15,000 schools around the world. And so I kept going, looking at it. And there's a lot of things in the 2009 book that I raised as questions that keep consuming me. Like some parts I didn't understand very well. Like we'll come back to it, I'm sure, but the whole effect size of all the teaching methods. The effect size of some of the influences were very, very low, and that surprised me and many others. And many others treated it as a damnation of their method. I treated it as an opportunity to understand why they were low and therefore try and make them better. I have to say I'm one of the honoured by the fact that I have the world's best critics. As an academic, you could spend your whole life and no one would care. The fact that they care is really important. And I attend to a lot of the criticism. Some I don't attend to because I don't think they're correct. Some I do. And that's what also kept me going is listening to theirs. I've had interactions. One of my biggest critics out of Denmark, he rang me one day or emailed me one day and said he wanted to come to Australia and talk with me for a few weeks. And we did that, and it ended up we actually wrote a book together. He still is one of my best critics, but I really, really appreciate the criticism, and he's helped me a lot in terms of refining my views. And so I've tried to spend a lot of time in the last 10 or 15 years coming up with an even better story as I can that not only explains the data, but also has that forward-looking projection. And as you'll see in the new book, even though it's, as you say, it's not a novel, there's actually a little less data in that book. There's no references to the meta-analyses, and I've changed a bit, partly because I've put those elsewhere. And if I kept them in this book, it would have been another 200 or 300 pages, and it's already long enough. And so I'm hoping this book is more about the story, and I hope it provokes people to have attention to whether they agree or not disagree with me. Andrew, what I find remarkable is that even though I've been publishing on this for a long time, and since 2009, the book, no one's come up with a better explanation. And I still challenge my colleagues to come up with a better explanation, and I'll be the first to agree with them if it makes sense. So it's still a work in progress.
Yeah, is the person your biggest critic, was that Paul Kirshner in Denmark or somebody different?
No, it's Stan Lepper-Larsen. Okay, Stan Larsen. No, Paul and I have had interactions. We disagree on some things, agree on others, but that's the beauty of this work.
Right,
is that you have. It's the old story that you're trained at academia: critique the ideas, not the person. And so when people critique ideas, I'm there.
Right. Well, I did talk with Paul as well on the podcast, and he and I have quite a bit of disagreements. And if I'm correct, I think you even cite one of his studies in here. There is a Kirshner. I don't know if it's the same one, but yeah.
Oh yeah, no, his work is stunningly excellent. He's one of the best learning researchers in the world, and so I've been following his work. We've had interactions over the years, and it's those kind of people that you get blessed to have discussions with.
Right.
Because it's great.
Yeah. Well, as you said, and I said, it's not a novel, but there are some through lines in sort of a story, and at least some of that, as I see it, is about the maybe an increased importance or attention to the cognitive complexity of things, and that certainly resonates highly with me. And related to that, I think, is, as you would call it, knowing that, knowing how, knowing with. And then, if I'm understanding it correctly, you're sort of paralleling those with surface, deep, and transfer. And then also this idea of evaluative thinking. And those two things, those things are, I think, sort of the story along the research that you've done. So when you talk about knowing that, knowing how, and knowing with, and if you want to use surface, deep, and transfer, how, like, unpack that for folks, I think, because I think that's really important.
Like, it primarily came from two parts, Drew. The first was the meta-analyses on cognitive task analysis, which is very jargon sounding. And a lot of people have done that work in other areas, like in aeronautics and surgery. And I looked at all that and I thought, how do I translate all this into the education system? And the second part was John Biggs, who's a very good friend who introduced the notion of surface, deep, and transfer, said to me one day, he said, "You have a different concept of surface to me." And I thought, oh, and I did. And one of the problems with the word surface is it gets interpreted as shallow,
right,
and of no value. But it's a much stickier concept than knowing how, knowing that, knowing with. I acknowledge that. So I've kept both of them, primarily to say surface is actually about the content of the knowledge. And I went back to a 1940s philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, who'd made that distinction, and many, many others, Paul Kirshner, and many others have done that distinction between conceptual and declarative knowledge. And I thought, how do I make it a sticky notion? And the key argument is that if you analyze classrooms, and like I've got 20,000 hours of teachers' transcripts, so when I analyze that, 90% of what happens in the classroom is about the facts, the content, the knowledge. 90% plus of the feedback, oral and written, is about the content. 90% of the questions we ask in high-stakes exams can be answered by knowing lots, the content. 90% of our feedback, oral and written, about the content, so on. So for students, they think learning is about knowing lots. Now, what's happened in our business is that we get into these dichotomies and we say, oh, we want a curriculum that's knowledge rich. No, we don't. We want a rich that's problem based.
Right.
And we have this massive. And when I worked out this distinction, this knowing how, knowing that, knowing with, and unraveled it relative to the teaching strategies, it all made more sense to me. Like, take problem based teaching. We know it has an incredibly low effect. All those kind of inquiry, teaching, discovery, no matter what you call it, how you define it, very low effects. And many of my critics got angry with me. And I said, no, that's what the evidence shows. Our job is to explain why it's so low. And it turns out that if the focus of the lesson is on the surface, the knowing that, the content, problem-based learning has an effect size of 0.15. When it's based on the deeper relationship and the transfer, the effect size is 0.5. So it works at the right time.
Right.
It doesn't work at the wrong. If students don't have the knowledge, skills, and content before they go into problem-based learning just doesn't work. So it's those religious messiahs out there who claim they're problem-based discovery teachers is our problem. There's a right time and there's a wrong time for it. And that's the instructional alignment argument, is that we need to be a lot more clued in to what is the cognitive complexity of what we're teaching. Is it the content? And my argument, Drew, is I'm greedy. I want you all to be greedy. I want both. I want content. I want depth. And one of our arguments that we're doing in our work now is using the backward design notion and saying, let's work out the problems we want the students to solve. Let's work out the problem-solving strategies they want to solve. And then say, and what is the content and skills they need to move there? Oh my goodness, suddenly about 60 to 70% of the content of the curriculum goes out the window. It's not relevant to the problems we want students to solve. And the other argument we make is have two success criteria, one about the knowing that and one about the knowing how and with. Have two assessments, two assignments. Have two different kinds of feedback and be much more evaluative about knowing when. And our little, not joke, but our little sticky notion that we try and get across is the easier way to remember this model is the Kenny Rogers model. It's the knowing when to play them and knowing when to hold them. Mm-hmm. And it's that argument that it's not the teaching method that works. It's the when you use the teaching method relative to the content. So there's a lot of stuff in that cognitive complexity stuff.
Right.
But I'm hoping that I'm trying to unravel it and say, we need to move forward by coming up with teaching methods that cross the various levels of the depth of content. And quite frankly, I can only find two methods that have ever done that. One is the jigsaw method. And I don't know if you know the jigsaw method. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of gets it right, because it has a phase in that method where it focuses on getting the students to know the content and then getting the students to go and use it deeply. And the other one, which is probably lesser known, is the Pardere method, which is quite big in North Carolina. I'm a great fan of that, because that also looks at what they call didactic teaching, the Socratic method, and the coach product. They kind of cross the methods.
Yeah.
And I'm inviting listeners, go out there and discover a new method. Put together direct instruction and reciprocal teaching. Who wouldn't want the acronym DIRT? Get smarter about putting methods together at the right time, focused on the content. So that's helped me unravel. And also, we did a lot of work over the last few years on looking at learning strategies. And once again, can I come up with the top 10, 12 learning strategies? Yes, I can. But they differ depending where in the model you are, on the knowing how. Like memorization has an effect size of 0.03 when you're first being exposed to the knowledge. When you consolidate knowledge, it goes up to 0.7. There's a right time for memorization, there's a wrong time.
Right.
And it's part of the problem I see in schools is they get obsessed with one answer fitting. But so that's what I'm getting across with this knowing how. And it's took me a long time to work that out. And hopefully it took me sufficient time to write it in a way that kind of was like a novel, Drew.
Well, we're going to talk about the jigsaw, because the results there actually surprised me, and I think will surprise lots of folks. And also talk about direct and explicit and problem-based, I would call project-based, and inquiry, and all of those things as we kind of work through some of the pieces in the book. But I think your point, that is where I have really landed. And I have been an advocate of project-based learning and inquiry for years, and that's a lot of the work that we do. And to your point, like, it has been really helpful for me. I mean, I have heard pushback from folks who are big advocates of direct instruction or explicit instruction, and again how that's defined, and you've got some interesting definitions there, and effect sizes. But it has really helped me think more about, when we do project-based learning, how do we help the teachers make sure that they're understanding that this is not discovery learning, that we do need to scaffold these things in. There does need to be, some, if we're going to call it direct or explicit, there's some scaffolding, and it is incumbent upon the teacher to figure out, as you said, sort of the cognitive complexity of the task, and what do they need to know, and when do they need to know it. And that's a really, as I wrote in my notes, it's your message in this book is the surface, deep, and transfer, the three knowings, is really balancing those things, and just the absolute essential piece of that. And it can be really frustrating, I think, at least for me it is, because as you expressed, like, there are people who are sort of religiously dogmatic about one camp or the other. And I mean, people will tell me project-based learning is terrible, you're hurting kids. And, I hear the other side of it is, their direct instruction, there's too much lecture, which is not the same thing, and I'm sure you've heard all of it, right? The other thing that I think is important to sort of define is this idea of evaluative thinking, and I think that's an interest. I've not heard that terminology the way that you phrase it, but you've got some really interesting, like the essence of expertise, and invokes critical thinking and problem solving, whereby the educator and student seek evaluative data. I mean, you define it a number of times, so I want to press you, like, what's your definition?
It's very easy, Drew. Permission to be nosy.
Permission to be nosy?
Yeah, evaluative thinkers are very nosy. I want to understand, if you're my student, Drew, I want to understand how you're thinking. I want to understand why you got that answer which was wrong, and what went wrong and what went right. I want to understand your passion. I understand your motivation. And so that's the very simple notion of evaluative thinking. But I like the phrase because it emphasizes the concept of value. Mm-hmm. But you as a teacher has to make priorities. You have to value certain things. You have to be able to stand in the shoes of others to understand how Drew is thinking. Right. That's a key part of everything. You've got to realize that I'm a teacher. I'm a human. I've got biases. Like, I have incredible biases as a teacher, and I know this, as a confirmation bias. I look for evidence I did a good job. And that's the exact opposite what I should be doing. I should be looking for evidence I did a bad job, so as the teacher I can improve. But I'm a bit of a Pollyanna, and I think, when a student answers a question in class, I say, yeah, they all got it. They didn't all get it. That one student did.
Right.
And I know that students who put their hands up know the right answer or think they know the right answer, so I choose them. That's not the way it should be done. I should be randomly picking students. So that evaluative thinking, that massively school, and it came out in the 2008 book, not as clear as this, but it's not what we do that matters. It's how we think about what we do that matters. And then I spent a lot of time trying to understand what that thinking was. And as you see in the book, we have mind frames, 10 of them, for teachers, for leaders, for students, for parents. And we're actually working at the moment on 10 mind frames for culture and climate of the school. Because another change in the book from 2008 with leaders is the argument here now is leaders have more influence by the way they develop the culture and the climate of the school than they have on anything else to do with their teachers. And so looking at all that, but what underlies those mind frames? It is that notion of evaluative thinking. And I ask you amongst your teaching colleagues, which of your teachers are nosy, which are not? Which teach the class as if it's a performance as opposed to realizing it's a massive staccato. It's in and out, it's up and down. You have to adjust and change depending what happens. And that requires a lot of skill, a lot of effort. And I want to go back. And we have many, many of the teachers who are doing this now. This is not something I'm saying should happen there because it's not. It's happening now.
Right.
And that's what we looked at, those teachers. And we've got this big project looking at this. And it came out of David Berliner's work of the 1990s on expert teachers. And he came up with same kind of conclusions, kind of different language, but very, very powerful.
Yeah. Well, I have often said, teachers, really great teachers, are incredibly perceptive. So you're not only using data, but you're also using your perception skills to read and make judgments based on that. And I think that fits with that sort of evaluative thinking idea. So it might be helpful too, I think, to unpack just briefly. So you've got sort of the research methods that you've engaged in, and you talk about the importance of hinge points and this robustness and the visual scale, I think, as your wife came up with, right? If I'm remembering right. Yeah. So kind of give us just a brief overview of the important pieces of the actual research methods and I suppose the ways in which you're displaying it.
She came up with it. She's also a professor of evaluation, which probably explains a bit why I look at evaluative thinking. One of the things that I worried about when the publisher said to me, "Will you update the book?" And I said, "Look, I'm resistant to do it because even when an average effect size changes at the second decimal point, people get upset. Oh my goodness, it's changed. How could that be? Right. I've been using 0.62, it's now 0.61. Well, as you know, Drew, that's just the nature of the business. And so what I thought of doing was say, how do I get a measure of that? Now, I tried to do it in the barometer last time in terms of the variability, the variance, which for a statistician is very critical. And people missed it. They didn't see it. And so this time I thought I'd get it a little bit more direct. So I invented this concept called robustness on a scale of 1 to 5. If it's a 5, it means it's very robust. It's based on a large number of meta-analyses, studies, effects, fail-safe, etc. If it's 1, be cautious. There's probably one meta-analysis with 30 studies. Another study could come along, it could change a lot. So it's trying to introduce that notion that if things change, a lot of things won't change. Some will change. So it was a bit of trying to get across the variance notion. Because many of my critics were upset that wasn't there, even though it's always been there, but it wasn't highlighted as enough as it should have been. Meta-analysis is just simply a statistical way of doing a literature review. Some people don't like it, the method, some do like it. It's just part of the picture of what we do in research now. It's kind of exciting in a way, Drew, because it was invented by an educator, Gene Glass, but it's huge in medicine. So we've made a huge contribution to the medical profession. Now, they have something we don't have. They can control their dosage of their implementation. We can't do that as well, so there's problems. We should always look for moderators, things that affect the average. A lot of critics have been upset about that, and I challenge them. Well, demonstrate where it does. It's hard to find it in our business, despite it's one of the premises that every kid is different. It turns out there's a lot of commonality. And you others got a bit upset that there are two different ways of calculating effect size. One when you do a two-group comparison, one you do a pre and post. I've separated that out and shown that it doesn't make much of a difference. Yeah, you should pay attention to it still. And so I do spend a bit of time in the book looking at the critics, looking at their comments. I have published separately articles that are free on the web about all the criticisms. And as I said earlier, some of them I'm very attentive to. Mm-hmm. Some of them, quite frankly, I'm not attentive to because I'm not convinced they say much.
Right.
I'm resistant at reacting to critics in the literature because I think that should be encouraged. And the last thing I want people to think when they write an article, he's going to come back and hit me over the head. No, I'm not. I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to make my judgment, but I want others to make those judgments as well.
Right. One of the things, speaking of criticism, one that I've heard, and I'm curious how you selected the meta studies and the studies that you've looked at. I think, and maybe you've written about this, but that you've included studies that are perhaps outside of the range of what some people would say would actually tell us something about that. Have you heard that? And if so, how do you pick that?
Like in the first book, I made the comment that I'm not going to talk about the quality of meta-analysis because that's done plenty of places elsewhere. And that was interpreted as he doesn't care about quality. Of course I do. And even in the first book, I pulled some areas out, like learning styles. The meta-analysis in that area were abysmal. They're just fundamentally wrong in many cases. They used R-squares as effect sizes. They're just wrong. Now, in the new book, I've ditched all those kind of things. There's quite a few that I don't talk about. If you go to MetaX, which is the free on-site place with all the data in it, I mentioned most of the important ones. I hope to think all the important ones. But of course, quality matters. Now, here's my problem. When people do a meta-analysis, many of them now code for quality, as they should. And it's an open discussion. If you show that the qualities of the studies don't make a difference, does it matter if you include them? Some do, some don't. But I do a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. I don't have access to those original articles. So it's a much more different question for me to comment on the quality of meta-analysis. But there are some. Like a meta-analysis done on 4 studies is not worth the paper it's written on. And so I excluded all those kind of things. Okay. And so, yeah, I do worry about that. But I spend more time than anything on trying to understand what the meta-analysis is saying. Mm-hmm. And that's where I do my quality control.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, before we get into the specific chapters and some of the highlights and questions that I have, maybe it's worth having you say kind of a word or some words about your view, like the purpose of school and purpose of education and teaching, because I think that plays a big part in lots of the chapters and lots of the writing that you've done here, lots of the results.
Yeah, this is where Sten Lever Larsen from Denmark was. The title of the book we did was The Purpose of Schooling, to really say that you really have to take into account the social issues around the child, the restrictions on what teachers can and can't do, the role of the family, and et cetera. And so I do spend a bit more time on that here, and not a lot in the book, because, as I say, we wrote a whole book on the topic. And we also know that when children come to school, they don't leave their culture, their home, at the school gate. They bring it through the school gate. So and I acknowledge that in the first book and spent a lot more time on the second book. Mm-hmm. I still take the view that I'm more interested in what educators can and cannot change, notwithstanding there are many other things that count, like poverty and race and so many other issues as well. And so and it actually surprised me, Drew, but one of my reviewers very recently, he now has it as a byline in his email. The statement I make that I make no excuse for focusing on achievement because I can't understand what the purpose of schools would be if achievement wasn't key. And he thought that was a really profound statement. To me, it's a very obvious statement that I make no excuse that achievement is one of the major functions of school. We set up schools so that students can learn what we think is valuable, both the content and the ways of thinking, not only to help them as they create their future. And I make that a very strong point in the book. We don't create the students' future, they create their future. Mm-hmm. But we also do it to pass on what we see as valuable in our society. And in your and my society, that has got, as John Dewey was wax lyrical about, is democracy, is the way we treat others. Mm-hmm. That's not true in some societies, but in our society, that's pretty critical. Right. So how do you create a sense of fairness in the classroom? How do you teach students to respect themselves and respect others? I also very much care that I want students to become their own teachers, which means we're going to have to teach them how to learn. Now, Gert Bester, a big critic, says we've overemphasized learning. And I would argue the opposite. We've overemphasized facts and knowledge and teaching. And he's right. Learning is about something. We need to get that balance right. And so I think I do want to teach students, because some students don't know how to learn. Some students don't know how to consolidate knowledge. Some students don't know how to transfer. And I think those are the kind of things we should be teaching. So I care about teaching kids the learning strategies so they can progress through to achieve higher achievement. I care about teaching students to have the confidence to take on challenges, because no kid comes to school to learn that which they already know. It's what they don't know. And I care about whether the student is taught to feel invited to come back and learn. And so I'm hoping that's a much more balanced view, because my critics, not unreasonably, said that he was obsessed with achievement. And I am. But I'm greedy. I want more.
Well, one thing that comes through in your writing in the book, but also this is a great resource for this, is what I would say the complexity of inputs and desired outputs, right? So as you're mentioning, there's all of these factors with every single student, and the complexity of those things are inputs in some way, and we're trying to get these desired outputs, which are also complex because they are surface, they are deep, they are transfer. There's just such a complexity about it, and it comes through. And I would encourage folks to use this book in many ways, but one way to sort of think about it through that frame, to say, all right, so how do we put all of these complex pieces together towards, as I think you said in our last podcast, and I think you even talk about here, is not doing what works, but what works best, right? And that really comes through in lots of the book here.
Yeah. Just one of the ways to sum that up is we use the alliteration skill, will, and thrill. Mm-hmm. And we argue that when a student walks into a classroom, they come with certain skills, like prior knowledge, intelligence, culture, home, working memory. They come with certain wills, that disposition to be able to take on challenges. Mm-hmm. And they come in with certain thrills, certain motivations, such as to master and understand. And our argument is that they are also the three outcomes. We want to value all three. Now, your country and my country gets obsessed about one of them, the skill. And heaven help us, and please don't let any politician hear this. We should be obsessed about the will and the thrill too, but I hope they don't come up with standardized tests for those. Those are really critical outcomes. And one of my arguments is that high achievement is not necessarily a good thing. And we get here in Australia obsessed with higher achievement, and as a consequence, we have many schools that are cruising, kids who are high in achievement but don't make any progress. I'm greedy. I want progress and achievement. I want the wills and the thrills. And so it's trying to get that. And one of the nice things that's happened over the last 10, 15 years is others have gone out and did meta-synthesis of self-esteem, self-concept. They've looked at self-regulation. We've done work on learning strategies. There's one coming out on motivation soon that's doing what I did to achievement. They're doing to other areas. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, I've written about this a bit and talk about the difference between a culture of achievement and a culture of teaching and learning, and I'm sure there's other ways to frame it, but that culture of achievement does drive and incentivize certain behaviors and actions that often are counterproductive for students and certainly for teachers, which then has a downstream effect on students, of course. You sort of alluded to it, but the chapter 5, which is about students, you talk and really sort of write about the importance of how students view themselves as learners. And I think That is, I mean, it's not a new concept, but I think it's a really important one. And as part of that was a discussion between motivate or sort of distinction between motivation and engagement, and then also the surface deep and strategic motivation. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm curious, what you might add as sort of meat to those bones.
It's that empathy notion, Drew, of how do you stand in the shoes of the students and understand their world. Excuse me. And like take the concept of engagement.
Mm-hmm.
It was Amy Berry and our team showed that when you ask teachers, how do you know students are engaged? The answer is they're doing the work. Well, in a lot of doing, there's not much learning. And a lot of doing, it's too easy and they get bored.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of doing is just getting it finished and handing it in regardless of quality. And so getting past that to try and say, I want the students to struggle. I want the students to make mistakes. I want the students to be at the edge. And therefore, I have to create an environment of trust for that to happen. And so a lot of the work in the students is, what is it from their point of view? Now, one of my frustrations is there's a lot of talk about student voice. I want it to be student voice about learning. Like a few years ago, we were writing up our chapter on the learning strategies. I said to my colleague Greg Donoghue, I said, why don't we go through the 20,000 hours of transcripts that we've got here and find examples of when a teacher thought aloud, or when a teacher asked the student to think aloud, or when the teacher heard the student got something wrong and invited them to use a different strategy. And in 20,000 hours, we found zero. And that was a bit of an eye-opener. And then we followed it up with other people. And I actually tried to do a meta-synthesis of classroom observation. So we spent a lot of time on it. And it doesn't happen. And so as much as we want it to. And so the argument there is we really need to spend more time listening to how students are thinking and how they're making processes. Because the students are doing that. The students sitting there and saying, look, Drew got the answer right. How did he do it? Well, obviously he knew the answer and he got it. Now, if I actually got into your brain, Drew, and I would know as a great learner, you went in a particular direction to get the answer and realized that was a wrong direction. So you did error detection. You went back and you went in another way and you kind of like staccato to get there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a linear jump. Now, some of our students have no idea that that's what's happening. They have no idea about error detection. Like take spelling. The worst thing you can do in spelling is give kids high frequency words. The problem in spelling is they can't error detect. The best thing ever happened to poor spellers was those little red lines under the Word documents. It's a mistake. And so teaching the students how to error detect, teaching the students to have, when the first strategy doesn't work, have you got an alternative strategy? And some of our kids don't. They have one strategy, it doesn't work, they keep applying that strategy. So I'm getting to the notion of how do you get and understand their ways of thinking? Now, it turns out there's a right time and a wrong time to do it. When it's about learning the facts and the knowledge, no, that's not the time. Reteach it, get it right. But when it's about connecting ideas, the problem-based, that's when we want to hear students thinking aloud. And here's the parallel. And it's no different in the staff room. In the staff room, do you have opportunities for teachers to think aloud? A lot of staff rooms aren't safe to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's really not a healthy staff room.
Right.
You go into schools, I work in schools, you probably work in schools where it is a healthy thing to do in the staff room.
Right.
That's really exciting, but I've changed it to teachers, and you wanted to keep on chapter 5.
Yeah. Well, you're reminding me of, and I think you cite his work in this as well, or their work, Ron Richhart, and is it Mark Church? I know it's Church is the last name, right? Anyways, the visible thinking and the idea of not just getting what's in the teacher's head out, but also getting what's in the student's head out so that we can build on it and do all of the other things that a good teacher would do. And but coming back to the surface deep and strategic motivation, I think I stole his language of cognitive engagement versus behavioral engagement, and obviously there's a easier easier path to behavioral engagement, but cognitive engagement is more difficult to achieve and sustain. Curiosity is one of those things, and I was interested to find, the robustness level of 2, positive activating curiosity, but a pretty high effect size of 0.74. And how you think that sort of plays in, because I hear about this a lot, right? Activate kids' curiosity, build on kids' curiosity. What do they want to know? What do they want to think about? But that's not always easy to do, and can also, especially because kids can be fickle about what they're curious about, can be a little bit of a loss leader or something like that. So how do you think about those, especially as they're related to the different kinds of motivation?
Look, you're right, it is difficult to do, but teachers don't shy away from the difficult. And Ron Rickard's the guy you're talking about from Project Zero is probably, I think, one of the best looking at the thinking strategies behind that and the focus on that, and they're really powerful. And I'm a granddad. I've got 2 3-year-olds at the moment. They are stunningly good at being curious. And I also got a 7-year-old who's been to school for 2 years, who's losing that curiosity and thinking her job's compliance. As it's what you do in schools, particularly at that age. And so it's bringing that curiosity out, and it's asking, this is the fun part here, Drew. Some group of researchers got together and they come up with this phrase, elaborate interrogation. Now, isn't that the most jargon-filled phrase? And it simply means you ask the student why. Why is it so? Why do you think it's so? And so you're invoking the curiosity. You're not, like most people think of curiosity is you give kids tasks that they're curious about. No. How do you invoke the curiosity? So I'm doing this maths problem, I'm doing this piece of music, and I'm playing take 5 and 5/4 time and say, why did he write it in 5/4 time? That invokes the curiosity. Now, it doesn't mean you then let the student wallow in their ignorance. You help them come up with answers to their curiosities. Well, let's investigate, let's try this. It's like what we try and do as empirical scientists. Come up with alternative explanations. Which one applies best? It's not the Jeopardy answer. It is the multiple answers. And so curiosity is something we invoke. It's not something we wait for. And if you want to have any chance of getting at curiosity, ask more why questions.
Yeah, I think Ron...
What we do in school...
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. What we do in school is we ask what questions. We should be asking why questions as well.
Yeah, Ron, going back to Ron's work, one of the things that I've taken away and I really like, and it I think resonates with those why questions, is asking what makes you say that, right? So really unpacking and pulling. We talk about pull teaching, thinking about how do you pull that thinking out of students and that activate that curiosity, that inquiry process. So, well, let's move on.
As opposed to push theory.
Right. Well, that's exactly how we talk about it. How do we shift from a lot of push teaching, although we need some, right? How do I get this information out, but not at the expense and the opportunity cost of pull teaching and getting that curiosity and getting that critical thinking and that kind of thing. Oh, well, let's move on to home and family. So chapter 6, there's a couple of things that I thought was really important and stood out to me. One was the distinction that you make between sort of socioeconomic status, which is not necessarily exactly the right term here, but setting that as apart from the importance of prior achievement, because one could come from a poor home in lots of ways, but have perhaps lots of prior achievement. It's not as likely, and I think that's one of the things we see, but that really trying to recognize and assess that prior achievement is really a big important piece here, right?
Yeah, but there's a problem there. And that 30 or 40 years ago, we had an independent measure of a person's capabilities, intelligence tests. And yes, they had a very dirty history and they were very misused. But we use that alongside achievement. The problem today is we've only got achievement. And if a student comes with prior achievement that's low, we say the student's not very able. I know across America that some of your future billionaires, some of your best military commanders, your best computer programmers, your best doctors and nurses are from low economic backgrounds, and we'll never discover them because they don't have the opportunity. And so the opportunity here of not having an independent measure is huge. If we only use achievement, it's kind of a vicious circle. People with prior achievement, well, they're prior achievement. It's maybe because of lack of opportunity. It may be because of issues to do with schools and teaching not being as good as they should be. Mm-hmm. But that kid is tremendously handicapped because prior achievement is used as the only proxy. So I want us to be a lot more open to seeing other ways of doing it. The most powerful way that I can know of at the moment is this notion of our expectations. Like when we interviewed every kid in the 5 lowest SES schools in New Zealand a few years ago when they started school and asked their parents, what did you want them to do when they left school? 90% plus said they wanted to go on some kind of tertiary, to a technical college or a university or a community college. When we interviewed those same parents when they went from elementary to high school, they said, we want them to get a job. We failed them as a system. You can't tell me across 5,000 students that less than 10% would go on to tertiary. We set lower expectations because they had no prior learning. So what are our expectations? Our job is to find and create the opportunities for the best in the class, because they're probably sitting there right now. And so that's the dilemma we face. And I know I'm getting away from the home here, but coming back to the home, it turns out of all the home influences, the most powerful are parents' expectations. And so some parents have very low expectations. And I was recalling yesterday, someone was telling me that a parent came up to them and said to them at one point as a teacher, no one ever told me my child could go on to university. Well, that's pretty dismal. Every kid, the world's their oyster when they're 5. They should have high aspirations. They should have high expectations.
Yeah. Well, one thing, and I don't want to linger on it too long because I know there's lots to talk about here. But the parental involvement, the effect size was pretty small. And one thing that surprised me was that the parental supervision was not particularly effective, and so you found some things there that I would have intuitively thought to be quite a bit different. I don't know if you want to say anything briefly about that.
Well, firstly, students shouldn't be penalised because their parents can't. Like, every parent wants to help their kid. Some parents just don't have the skills to do it. And that's why we made it compulsory to send them to school. And it's kind of like coming back to the homework argument. Any homework that requires parent involvement has a 0 to negative effect. Homework should be about a chance to deliberately practice something already taught. It should be not doing something brand new. And so I also take the line that your country and my country spends enough time in schools. I don't understand why we want to make them spend more time at home doing schoolwork, but that's another question. But our parents are very powerful in this equation. They're the essence of love. They're the essence of acceptance, of belonging of the kid. And that's not true in some households. That's why we have schools. They're the safe havens for many kids. And so, our argument is that parents are not first teachers. They're first learners. How the parent learns, the kid learns. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. And our job to give the kid other alternatives. And look, we're educators. We have very little influence on the parents. We still should engage them. We still should involve them. We should be sending, every child should go home each day as the best advertisement for the power of schooling. We should be sending kids home with what you said before, the whys. So that's what they talk about at the dinner tables, not what did you do at school, but what feedback did you get? What did you struggle with? Right. So they actually know it and support. But that's asking a lot of some families. But families are important, but on what we focus on in schools, much more power there.
Yeah. Well, moving on to School and Society, Chapter 7. One just really quick question, and I'm just curious if you've seen this, because you have a set of studies. The robustness level is 1, so it's small, but the teacher performance pay is 0.05, which doesn't surprise me much at all. But I'm assuming, and I couldn't tell from the brief write-up that you did, every time I've ever seen performance pay evaluated is, and I'm not in favor of performance pay, but it is usually the metric is, the output of students, right? The scores of students. And it strikes me, and I'm wondering if you've ever seen anything like this or think it would have any value, is to somehow I guess, evaluate teachers, if you want to use performance pay. Again, I'm not a fan of that, but based on the quality of their work, right? The work that they produce, the lessons and the structure and the conversations that they're having. It's obviously quite qualitative, right? Which is probably why we don't do it, but it strikes me as something that would be really, really helpful to focus on.
Well, firstly, that's a strange meta-analysis because the authors take that 0.05 and because it's statistically significant, their conclusion is it works. It's zero. It doesn't work. And part of the reasons, what you said, is that we don't have a metric that's causal. The reason the kid increased may be because of the previous teacher, may not because of the teacher. It's performance pay works when there is a very clear output. Now, coming back to your question, I've spent a lot of time in the last year in New South Wales. The question we're asking there is we have a supply issue at the moment. We have a rhetoric that teaching is hard work, it's burnout, it's workload's too high, which means people are not coming into teaching. We know the top 30% of our students, however measured, don't come into teaching. It's a major problem. Now, let's turn it on its head. What incentive, Drew, is there for you to be a better teacher? It's all internal.
Right.
There are no contingencies in the system. In fact, we actually have a system where you're paid on your age.
Right.
We have a system that we says if you're a brilliant teacher, we'll take you out of the classroom and make you a leader. And we need good leaders. But the contingencies for being good are not there. And we also know, certainly here in Australia, that after 7 years, you reach the maximum of your salary. And in many parts of your country, and I've just read the book on America's teachers, which has almost made me cry about how you treat some of your teachers in some of your states. There's no great incentive to be better. So what we're doing in New South Wales is we're trying to readjust the career structure to do exactly what you said. And we look at what every other profession does. As an academic, if I want to get promoted, they don't look at my student evaluations. They ask me to present a case, looking at my student evaluations, saying what I did as a consequence, looking at my research, looking at my impact, looking at my service, and they put a case, and you made the comment, and then there's a qualitative decision. That's exactly what there needs to be, a qualitative decision about whether you should get promoted or not. And so we've put the case to the profession. Can we change the career structure so that you have to put evidence that you're a highly accomplished or lead teacher? And I'd have to say, we went 117 roundtables to almost every second school in New South Wales. The overall dominant mood was no. We're not in this profession for money. We're in it for the noble Florence Nightingale. We're killing our profession with that.
Right.
I would argue visible learning shows that we have some stunningly excellent teachers that we should esteem, acknowledge, and recognise. Our system doesn't. Now, we're moving ahead on this. We're in trials at the moment in some schools where they're asked to put forward cases. And of course, we're helping them put the case. But there's no one size fits all. And we are prepared to pay a lot more to keep our best teachers in the classroom because we want to say to people coming in, you can come into a profession and after 7 years, you're not going to be lockstep on your salary. You can increase as a function of expertise. We esteem and value expertise. So you're right. We have to solve the problem of career structures, but it's not going to be solved by performance pay.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I chuckled at a little bit, and I think is resonant with lots of folks who are sort of cynical about performance of schools and improvement of education, is this idea that I think, I'm sorry if I'm not getting this exactly right, but something like we're unlikely to improve education by inventing new labels for schools, right? And it comes around like we're going to reinvent. I mean, how many times are we going to reinvent and reimagine school? I see it every day. And, I don't want to be too crass to say, we should do everything the way that we always have done it, because that's obviously we've got lots of growth to go. But the takeaway is that there are some things that we know work, and we need to improve those things and think about what doesn't work. And even that is a little complex, but like some of the things you talk about is whether charter or religious schools or single-sex schools or school choice, all of those kinds of things, and just, putting lipstick on a pig kind of thing.
It is. The hardcore reality when you set up a charter school, within 6 months you're running a school, Drew. And like what keeps me going is as I travel the world, I see incredible, excellent schools, unbelievable schools, in the same system that down the road there's one that's not. So why is it? Now, I know why we do it. It's easy. It makes us look like we're doing something. But it's actually not doing much at all, if anything. It's what? And school choice has a close to 0.06, I think, effect. Only certain parents have choice. And part of your problem in your country and my country is that those who have choice send their kids to certain schools and are residualizing some of the other schools. And it looks like, therefore, that some of the state schools aren't doing very well. Now, I can show you, and it's not difficult to show you, that some of your schools in your lowest SE area, socioeconomic status areas of America have most stunning schools and teachers I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And I could pick out health and engineering high school in San Diego in a poor area. I've never seen a better school in the world, up in the top class. It can happen. But you're right. It is so much easier to blame the school system and reinvent it under another label. It looks like we're doing something. Now, here's the good news. Politicians find it very, very hard to change what happens inside the school gate. And that's probably a good thing. On the other hand, that's the problem. And like my argument, what I'm trying to do here in Australia now in my political life is saying, what did we learn in COVID? What we learned is that the system in COVID, in no place in the world, came up with ways to help teachers and principals teach during COVID. It was the biggest educator-led revolution we have ever seen. Why aren't we enabling our principals to write policy, not just get it and react to it at the last minute? Right? And doing that at the moment, I have to say they don't have any skills to do that. They're reluctant to do it. It's not part of their skill set at all. We have to make that part of their skill set. So how do we get them involved in writing? Every other profession does it. We need to get smarter at Principals Association becoming better lobbyists, better at writing policies. Like when I go into climate change, when I go into medicine and engineering, I work with ministers and they say, like, I've got this policy that this group's come up with. Let's interrogate it. I never heard that in the 66 ministers I've worked with, director generals I've worked in the last 10 years, not one of them has said something has come from a school. It's all top down. What do you do top down? You fiddle with the structure.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting idea to have schools and school leadership actually working on that. That I hadn't thought of. Well, I want to move on because there's so much, and I feel like I'm glossing over. This is over 400 pages, but one thing I do want to hit on in Chapter 7 that I think is really important, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, because you mention it, and I think we can't. We're talking about leadership and effective leadership, and you talk about intellectual stimulation, among other things, as characteristics, being able to intellectually stimulate and provide intellectual stimulation in structures and things that you're doing. I talk about as intellectual nourishment. And you mentioned the teacher's lounge where that's not safe, right? But we have to have, and our schools have to have those kinds of things if we're going to attract and retain really evaluatively thinking teachers, right? It's like I remember leaving the classroom in 2012 and felt pretty burned out because, in large part, I was not getting that intellectual stimulation, that conversation, that give and take, that critique, that question, that curiosity. And so I don't know if I just want to make sure that got out on the record here, and if there's anything you want to say on it before we move on to Chapter 8.
The key to do that is making sure that problems that require multiple interpretations are the focus of discussion in the lounge. Same in the classroom. If it's about getting it right, working out the bus timetables, that is not the focus of intellectual stimulation. Obviously it is for the people who do it, but it's those multiple interpretations. We as teachers, our great teachers out there, they're incredibly curious, they're incredibly nosy, they want to know. So let's feed that and let's hear it. Now, where leadership comes in is how do you sort through the multiple interpretations? And there's the skills in doing that. How do you get an agreement, not necessarily consensus, but agreement about the next way to go? The easiest way to do that is to close your office door and do it in the privacy of your classroom and make it as an edict, a staff room. That is not what we're talking about. It is how do we get people like you people who have views, how do we get those on the table in a safe environment that leads to a conclusion? It's not just talk for the sake of talk. Yep.
Yeah.
Intellectual stimulation, no different from kids, no different from us.
Right, right. Well, the classroom effects chapter has lots in it. One thing that I found to be maybe a bit intuitively interesting or dissonant, and some people certainly sort of rail against this idea of group work, small group learning. So it's a fairly high effect size, 0.46, but you do really sort of emphasize that skills need to be taught to be able to work in groups. And so, again, it needs to be done well. And when it's done well, it can be really effective, right?
Yes. And there's two parts to what you're talking there, Drew, is like what our employers are asking for now are people who can work in teams, who can translate and communicate, as well as having the knowledge. And that's really critical. And I came into your school when I see students sitting in groups working alone, when I see high-stakes assessment being done all individual, or when I see a mixture of individual and group. But here's the counter to that. As long as those small groups constantly are changing, the most invidious thing we do is we set them up permanently, we label kids, we track them, and they all have, and no child's a winner in those cases. So there's a fine line. So the argument is small group works, yes, provided it's focused, provided it changes. But the minute you start establishing permanent, quasi-permanent groups, either within or between classrooms, you see the negative slide dramatically, partly because the students know why they're in the elephants group. They know, and they also get less rich, complex, cognitively complex curricula. And so no to the whole labeling side, if that's the end point. But yes, teaching skills how to work in groups. Now, you've sat in groups and you've done group work. And if you're like me, I know that Drew's the smart one in the group. I'm going to get him to do the work and I'm going to loaf and do something else. That's one of the downsides. We're going to be smarter about that and how you get him. And it comes back to like the jigsaw method is a very powerful way for every child to make a contribution to the group. We need more of those kind of systems.
Yeah, and there are some accountability structures that we talk about because project-based learning has lots of that. So you've got to structure those things. And I've seen that effect as a student. I've seen that effect with my own kids and how they get frustrated with, oh, I have to do all the work. And yeah, so it's an absolutely essential piece. So Chapter 9, the teacher, and some of the things that were really interesting and again, sort of intuitively dissonant were the effects of certification and the effects of subject matter knowledge and how you talk about teacher beliefs maybe matter more than methods, which some people will probably yell at you about. Feel free to get out in front of it here.
Teacher subject matter knowledge has a very low effect, and I worried about it in 2008. And I did spend about 12 years doing various studies. I did about 6 or 7 studies, five of them failed miserably, to try and explain why it was so low. And the message I'm getting across here, Drew, is I accept the evidence. But that doesn't mean to say I stop there. I want to understand why it's low. And it was Kelly Picker in our team who looked at what is the knowledge that teachers have when they teach 5-year-olds to teach reading. And it turns out there's an interaction effect here. You can have the most incredible knowledge about phonemes and phonics and teaching of reading and not be effective. Or you can have no knowledge and be effective. It's the interaction. I cannot believe, I think we've estimated that $1 billion we've spent over the last 10 years in Australia taking teachers out of schools and giving them more science and maths knowledge with no effect. Because it depends how they then teach. If they teach focusing on the knowing that, all about the content, they don't need a deep knowledge. They just need to be one page ahead of the kids. And that's what we found with the reading study, that if they didn't have a deep knowledge, they didn't allow students to ask questions. They were the focus of the classroom. Every time a kid had a problem, they had to come to the teacher. There was no learning how to decode by themselves. The structure of the classroom was consistent with very low-level surface knowledge. But when you have teachers who have deep knowledge and they allow their students to ask questions, to go into problem-based learning, to problem solve, then it makes a difference. So subject matter knowledge matters if there's a congruence between way we teach and that content. And I go back to my own university where we had 29 PhD students in our teacher education program. Half of them were hopeless as teachers because they ran the class like a lecture. They didn't need to know the knowledge. They could have lectured on almost surface level, 2 pages ahead of the kids. So I think I now better understand why subject matter knowledge is very low. If the class is focused so strongly on content matter knowledge, you don't need that depth of knowledge. You don't need to know about error detection. You don't need to know about alternative explanations. Dares you ask the question why if you have very low subject matter knowledge, and those teachers don't.
Right. Yeah.
So, yep, it's a low effect, but I think we understand why.
Yeah, so it's situational, and it gets at that complexity again. So you sort of started talking a little bit about it, but the chapter 10, which is about the curriculum, and you get into, and I don't know how aware you are of the reading wars, and Emily Hanford has really brought that to the forefront with her great podcast, and I did a podcast, a live event with Emily and Natalie Wexler and a couple other folks as well. So that is really hot and heavy. I mean, it's on CNN now. I mean, it's actually really hit the mainstream, which is really interesting, and you're certainly emphasizing the importance of phonics, talking a bit about balanced literacy, also talking a bit about math and the cognitive complexity there. Anything that you want to really make sure folks sort of hear, especially about the phonics and balanced literacy, whole language kind of things?
Oh, look, whole language balanced literacy has an effect size close to 0. Phonics is very high. It's pretty obvious to me that if kids don't have the skills to read, they need to be taught the skills to read. But here's the problem, Drew. Once again, we've dichotomized it, and we said either or. Like, I don't know how many classes I've been into of teachers teaching reading, and they're teaching a stunning phonics, phonemic awareness, the big 5. And just on that, I wish it was the big 6, because I think oral listening is pretty powerful. But they're doing this. And then you ask the students, they already knew how to do it. And so once you've got those skills, then some of those other teaching methods, the balanced literacy of that, starts to take over. But if you don't have the skills, balanced literacy is not going to get you there. And so why have we polarized it? Kenny Rogers is right. There's a right time for the big 5, and there's a wrong time for the big 5. There's a right time to move on to the appreciation of stories and books, and there's a wrong time. Once you've learned the skills of reading, then the enjoyment of reading and all that other stuff comes to the fore. But if you've never learned the skills of reading, it's over. And like one of my obsessions is the Matthew effect. If you can't get to basic literacy, numeracy by age 8, you never catch up because no one teaches you skills. And we're so nice as teachers. We give you tasks to do that don't require you to read. Well, that's a killer. Sooner or later, that's going to catch up to us. And so I see the reading wars, and I wished I never got involved with them, because those reading people, well, they know how to fight viciously. It's not either or. It's when. And I just hope that for my grandkids, if they can't read, they are taught the skills of reading. And I hope there's one day they move beyond teaching the skills of reading to the appreciation of reading. It's a matter of when.
Yeah, well, you're right. The reading wars are aptly named, and certainly lots of passion there. I'll just leave it at that. So the chapter 11 is teaching with intent, and it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, I think really so the next 2 is learning strategies and teaching strategies. So teaching with intent is almost like the sort of framework for then those learning strategies and the teaching strategies, right? I mean, maybe I'm not getting that right, but so one of the things that a distinction in chapter 12 and the learning strategies that jumped out at me was the difference between acquiring and consolidating. And I think that's an important one to sort of unpack if you could.
Isn't it ironic that I published a book in 2008 called Visible Learning, and there wasn't a chapter on learning? I've made up for it this time. Look, we're very good at teaching students about the facts and the knowledge. But kids are like us, Drew. Most of us can only hold between 4 to 6 things in our brain at once. And so that notion of how do we consolidate, how do we get the students to see the big ideas, the coat hangers, to hang all the content on? How do we do it? Now, ways we do it is this notion of deliberate practice. And that's not just practice, practice, practice. Deliberate practice means practice with feedback, practice with cues, with scaffolding. How do we get them to? We know that the oldest finding in psychology, 1856, Ebbinghaus, was that if you learn problems over time, it's better than learning at once. If I give you 10 problems to do and ask you to do 10 now, it's nowhere near as effective if I ask you to do one every hour or one every day. And there's concepts of interleaving. That is, start a lesson and teach X, then go and teach Y, then come back and teach X and teach Y. It's much more powerful than teaching X in one large group. And so all these notions of how we can get to this notion of consolidating, how we can use mnemonics. This is like memorization is a good example. When you're first acquiring information, memorization has an effect size of 0.03. In the consolidation phase, it goes up to 0.73. Now, only if that consolidated knowledge is then used in a problem situation. If that consolidation is used to pass a test, the day after the test, you forget it. And it's actually, I think it's more fascinating to study forgetting than it is to study remembering. Mm-hmm. Why is it we forget? And it comes back to those coat hangers. And so, yes, I think that we're not as good at teaching consolidating as we think we are. We jump from content straight into problem, and we don't realize that, hey, humans can't remember all those details. And I also think it's fascinating, Drew, that teachers have thousands, if not tens of thousands of measures of achievement. You ask any teacher to come up with a measure of achievement, it's an easy task. How many measures of learning have we got? And I just think that's an area. And one of the things I've been doing is, whilst writing the book, and subsequently, is we've released on our Hattie Family Foundation site a free learning strategy assessment that can be used by a teacher or a class to get a better understanding of what strategies the kids have. And now my argument is, I don't want you to then define the child in terms of those strategies. I want you to teach the strategies they're not very good at. So they start to build up. So when they've applied the first strategy and it doesn't work, they have an alternative strategy. I want us to get smarter about knowing how to consolidate so we can move on and use some of those other strategies and self-regulation and et cetera, et cetera. Mm. So that's the major argument in that chapter. Right.
And then the teaching strategy, so chapter 13, you really do unpack direct and explicit instruction, and those are, in your view, two very different things, or maybe not very different, but quite different things, usefully, importantly different, and so direct instruction having a 0.56 effect, and the explicit having a 0.63, and it's important, and I think this is important. I talk about this as well because we don't want to straw man direct instruction or explicit instruction, that it's just lecture and didactic, that kind of thing. But how can you unpack the difference as you see it between direct and explicit?
Oh, look, one of the things I observe is that the biggest critics of direct instruction are the explicit instruction people and vice versa, which is kind of madness. But it is a territory that's kind of unusual. I do spend time talking about direct and explicit of this. And as you said, it ain't standing up front and just talking.
Right.
It does require listening to what the students know and don't know. And that difference, quite frankly, isn't that much. And so I don't think a big debate about the difference between the two is that powerful. What was more important to me is when you use one and when you don't use it, making sure that it is involving listening as much as talking. And one of my other observations, Drew, is that the biggest lack in research, huge gap. Every teacher in the world goes home each night and creates lessons. Mm-hmm. And we have virtually no research on the quality of lessons. I'm not talking about lesson design strategies. I'm talking about the quality of lessons. And this is where sometimes it leads teachers. It's actually a lot easier to be a direct instruction teacher than it is to be a problem-based teacher. Mm-hmm. Because it's you doing the performing and you can control that. The minute you do problem-based, you give up control. And that's why some people find it very difficult. And we've talked about it already. I'm greedy. I want you to do both. And we certainly argue that at the knowing that, your performance is pretty critical. At the knowing how and knowing where, the student's performance is pretty critical. as the focus of discussion. And so I'm not greatly interested in the difference between explicit and direct. And I wished I or someone, and I spent a lot of time doing this and failed, come up with a better name that summarized those kind of methods. But I wasn't successful at doing that. And as you saw, I take a whole group of things that kind of align with direct instruction and explicit instruction and group them together. And I take a whole line and I call it problem solving rather than problem-based or project-based, because again, they tend to be templates that people use, and they're more illustrative of, you got it perfect before, of focusing more on the why and the how as opposed to the that.
Right, and you do a fair amount of writing and sharing on as you say, problem-based learning and the complexity of it and the ways in which why it works and what it works better for. Students taught using problem-based had less knowledge but better recall of their knowledge, probably because in problem-based learning, knowledge is more often elaborated, and consequently students had better recall of this knowledge, which some of the folks like Paul Kirshner would probably bristle at. And I would say that in project-based learning, the way that I envision it is that it does include direct, and so they're again, sort of figuring out teaching with intent, I think, is what you're after, right? Like what is the surface knowledge that we want? Well, okay, some direct and explicit instruction be appropriate here, and then as we build that throughout, we want to then get into the sort of, you say the application of knowledge, not the development of knowledge, is the heart of success of problem-based learning. So you're really kind of playing with the ideas and the concepts and the bigger things. And as I talked with anybody who is that advocacy arm of direct and explicit, it often is about efficiency, and it often seems like it stays very much in that sort of surface knowledge, and I don't want to mischaracterize that, because surely that's not what they mean, but it sure does. There's always talk about efficiency.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating you say that, because I actually don't see efficiency as much used as effectiveness. And like I look at efficiency and think, we're finishing a book at the moment on de-implementation and getting teachers to stop inefficient things. Oh my gosh, that's tough. Getting principals and systems to stop things that are inefficient is incredibly tough, because we've always done it this way. I found during COVID, I remember interviewing this 14-year-old boy and saying, what happens in your school? And he said, well, every night at 6 o'clock, the teacher sends us the work for the next day. He said, I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, I've done it by 8 o'clock, I spend the rest of the day gaming with my friends. What do I do at school for 5 hours? Now, at school, if he was efficient, he'd be punished by asking to do more. And so I think you've hit on a really fascinating notion that we should spend a lot more time on, and that is, how do we get more efficient at what we do? Like, I'm a big advocate of teachers having a 4-day week. I think we can get through in 4 days as much as we can get through in 5 very easily. Now, it's going to require a massive transformation of other things, but if you work at the word efficiency, like Finland has half the number of hours that kids are exposed to in a year than here in Australia. They're extremely efficient. We expand our work to fill the time available. What if we contracted our work to fill the time available?
Yeah, interesting. Well, and I'm mindful of time, and we're going to wrap up soon. There's a couple of things. I think this teaching strategies chapter, I think, is just really, really rich, because you do get into some of these hot button issues. The inquiry-based teaching, the effect size of 0.5, and that it does improve inquiry skills, but maybe other methods are needed to also add more positive effects on content and surface knowledge, of which I would certainly agree. That's where you have to figure out and think about the things that are, what are you trying to do, and how do you structure and scaffold that? Two other things that really stood out to me here was the effect size of constructivism and the jigsaw method. And the jigsaw method was very much a big surprise. I mean, as you write, that's the biggest effect in all the teaching strategies that you find. And it's overwhelmingly large compared to many of the others, and so that one I'm really surprised by, because I've seen, as I'm sure you have, it not done well. It's sort of like the group work and the accountability that you mentioned before, and feel free to comment on that. But the constructivism, was another one that really surprised me. So can you unpack that one for me? Because I really would not have thought constructivism would have had that big of an effect size.
Well, you've got to make the distinction between constructivism as a theory of knowledge and constructivism as a theory of teaching. It's a theory of knowledge. And when you look at the constructivist notion of teaching, it's a mess. And as we've already talked about, there's a right time to get kids to construct knowledge from what they know after they've got knowing to do that. And so I'm not a fan of constructivist methods of teaching. I think that's a whole set of language that's not conducive. And then I go to the jigsaw method, and it's fascinating. The first point is what you just said. You've seen it done badly. That's why I adopted the model of know, they, impact. I talk about probabilities. Jigsaw method has a high probability of effect. If you implement it badly, you kill that probability. So it's the two halves. And one of my frustrations in my early work is people will say, well, I'm going to do jigsaw method. And they did it badly and said, oh, it didn't work. Well, it didn't work because you did it badly. Overall, the probability is very high. Now, the beauty of the jigsaw method, and when I speak to large audiences, I ask show of hands, how many know the jigsaw method? It's 5 or 10%. So it's not widely known. I acknowledge that. And it's mainly 4 phases. The first, stage 1, and beautifully, it was invented by Eisen Aronson in the arts area to improve the teaching of art. And the first step is you get the students in groups of, say, 4 or 5. You assign them different tasks, say a reading task or watch a video or do a bit of experience. They do different tasks. And they learn about that. The second task, all the students student A in the first group all get together from all across the groups, and they teach each other about what they know and they don't know. And the leading question is, what did you not understand about what you've just read or done? So they all work together. So you've got a lot of peer teaching going on to get the content. Then they go back to the original groups, and person A explains their bit, person B explains their bit. So again, they're starting to film relationships between the ideas. And the fourth phase is they're given a task that requires them to put it all together. So you can see in there, you've got knowledge acquiring, step A. Step B, you've got knowledge consolidation, when they meet together with all their A's. Step 3, you start to get into planning and self-regulation about how you build ideas between part A, B, C, and D, and so on. And part E, when you consolidate that. It's perfect. And it really is nice the way it parallels how students learn. And as I was saying earlier, there are very few teaching methods that parallel the learning process. And that's the smart thing. And so my challenge out there to all your listeners, if you want to do a master's or a PhD, come up with a teaching method that crosses the different parts of the learning cycle, like the jigsaw method, like the Padere method. And my argument is we've got so many teaching methods out there, it wouldn't take much to be more careful. But when I asked, and I think I'm reasonably good at searching literature, when I asked for studies that told me when was the right time to do this rather than that, I couldn't find any. And I think that's a real big missed opportunity. We need to be a lot smarter about that Kenny Rogers notion of knowing when to apply these methods. When does the student have sufficient knowledge? We should stop teaching more knowledge and go into problem solving. When in problem solving should we stop problem solving to go back and teach the content? That's what we got to get smarter about.
Yeah. Well, the jigsaw method, as you showed here, is a FX size of 1.2, which is, compared to any of the others, was massive. And of course, if you do it poorly, that would go way, way down. And I think that you've got to make sure, one, that there's a level of accountability, and there's also some structures for making sure that the students are sharing the information well or accurately and all of those things, right? So the chapter 14 and 15, using technology, to me, the big takeaway was teaching methods is more important than any technology that you might use. And then in the chapter 15, the whole school, you do come back to and touch on homework again, which is, as I'm sure you're well aware, people have taken issue and written about and yelled about and all those kinds of things. So if you get the book, you can see what John says about that. It's on page 421. That's where I mark it. The chapter 16 is the moving ahead, and we started at the conclusion. This is again where you talk about some of the sort of learning, as you call them, 11, I think, leaps, right? two that stood out to me, one you've already touched on, is that we need more research on lesson plans. That is something that's really, really essential. Another one that I think maybe is a good ending note, and then, of course, if there's anything you want to talk about that we haven't before we share links or anything like that, is I just sort of paraphrase it as keeping perspective, right? That we're teaching children, not many adults, I think is how you put it. But, maybe you can, I'm sure you can expound on that and say it more gracefully and elegantly.
Well, as a dad of three boys, my obsession as a father was I wanted my children to enjoy their childhood. I wasn't preparing them to be adults. They were going to do that. My job was to make their lives as rich, as inquiry, as deep, as exciting as possible. And maybe I should have been more strict with them and made them do certain focused tasks, whatever. Sure, but it's the same here. That our job as teachers, they are children. They're going through incredible, massive changes in development, massive changes in brain development over those years. They don't think like adults. They are quite different. And we need to start that as our premise. We have not got many adults in front of us. We've got kids who know a lot but don't know a lot. We've got kids who don't have the strategies that we as adults have when we don't know what to do. They often don't know what to do. We do. We have strategies to do that when we're in situations where we're in strife, where we're in error, where we're making mistakes. And as you said right at the beginning, the biggest predictor of adult health, wealth, and happiness is not achievement at school. It's the number of years of schooling. We have to make schooling inviting for 5-year-olds to come back, for 10-year-olds to come back, for 15-year-olds to come back. And if I was the Commissioner of Education in America, my first act would be to lower the school leaving age to 10. And I think we'd solve the problem overnight of making schools inviting. I actually probably wouldn't do that. But my point being is I want kids to feel that this is the place where they can come and meet the passion of Drew Perkins, who genuinely, sincerely, with credibility, wants to improve my life, my world, my skills, my will, and my thrill. And Drew, I want to end by saying, and we have them now. They are all around us. Excellence is all around us. We just don't have the courage at times to recognize it whilst we deal with all the politics of distraction, both outside the school and inside the school. As a profession, why is it that we are the only profession that systematically denies its expertise? My fear is that we're going to continue to do that, and we're going to go down the spiral. We have incredible expertise, and I hope the book shows you the incredible level of expertise. And you made a comment earlier. It ain't easy. We're actually good as a profession at dealing with the hard and the difficult. We have some incredibly difficult kids that come into our classrooms. We have some concepts that we have to teach that are not easy. We're actually very good at that. We are the world's best change agents. And I want us to stand up and scream that we're actually very good at what we do. We are great at being educators. And that's the esteem of the profession comes back to those evaluative thinking skills that are absolutely germane to being a great teacher. It's out there now. And I just worry that our narrative is about all the other stuff and we disparage that expertise.
Yeah.
If I have any influence, I want to reintroduce that word expertise.
Yeah, well, the book is a wonderful resource and some great things, and many, 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 many things that we didn't talk about that are certainly in there. Things like what are some characteristics of really high performing teachers and maybe not, and leaders and those kinds of things. So I definitely found a lot of that to be valuable, and we'd be going on 3 hours if we were talking about every single thing. So I think I remember the last time you were on the podcast with your son. This is a test. I think I said, where can they find, your work, and do you have a website? And you said, oh, we probably should know that, or something like that. I may be misremembering that, but here's a test. Where should they go to find you? The book is Visible Learning, the sequel. It's on Amazon, I'm sure, and all the places. We'll put it on it's from Corwin Press, right? Or no, Routledge. Right. Yeah.
Well, we do have a Hattie Family Foundation. We've set up a foundation to give back. And it's not that exciting page, even though it's got the learning strategies assessment in there. Corwin Visible Learning is probably the major site if you want to get more stuff. I'm easy to find on email, and as you can see, Drew, I love talking about the stuff.
Yeah, and I love listening to you, and I love talking with you about it. Again, we could do it for hours and hours and hours, but we probably shouldn't. So, always great to talk. Thanks so much for the conversation. Thanks so much for the work and the book, and hopefully, as I always say, hopefully it is helpful.
Thanks.
Thanks again so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you found this conversation to be useful, thought-provoking, or something that's worth commenting on and sharing, please do so with your friends, your social networks, and leave reviews where you listen to your podcasts. It's really helpful for our podcast and hopefully for anybody that you might share with. And of course, please visit us at wegrowteachers.com if you have questions about our professional development, or email me at drew@teachthought.com.